You know that moment when you're sitting alone and everything just hits differently? You start replaying old conversations in your head, the ones that left you feeling small, confused, unseen. For so long, you tried to figure out what you did wrong. Maybe if I said less. Maybe if I cared less. Maybe if I changed more. But then one quiet night, something shifts. You realize it was never about you. That realization doesn't make you angry. It makes you free. A friend once told me my dad used to yell at me every day when I was a kid. For years, I thought I was the problem. Then one day, I heard him yelling at the TV the same way. I realized that's just who he was. That's when it clicks for most people. When you finally see that someone's reactions were never reflections of your worth, but mirrors of their own pain. They weren't cold because you were unlovable. They were cold because they didn't know warmth. They didn't walk away because you lacked value. They walked away because connection terrified them. That's when you stop chasing explanations. You start to see patterns. The people who use silence to punish you, they grew up in houses where silence was safety. The ones who lied were just afraid of being truly seen. It was never personal. It was programming. When that realization hits, you stop replaying things in your mind. You stop rehearsing comebacks to conversations that already ended. You stop wishing people would understand you, because now you finally understand them. Strangely, that understanding brings peace, not bitterness. Once you stop personalizing other people's pain, you start reclaiming your own energy. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop bending to be loved. You start speaking differently, softer but firmer. You stop proving your worth because now you see it. You were never the cause. You were simply the one who cared enough to notice. So if you're in that phase right now, blaming yourself for someone's distance, their silence, their inability to love you back, this is your reminder. You didn't fail. You were never broken. You were just in the wrong story. Now you finally get to write your own. For years, you carried weight that was never yours to carry. Every time someone treated you poorly, you turned it inward. You asked what's wrong with me instead of what's wrong with this situation. You made their inability to see you a referendum on your visibility. You made their inability to love you a statement about your lovability. You took their brokenness and wore it as your own flaw. That's what we do when we don't know better. We assume we're the common denominator in all our pain, so we must be the problem. But here's what nobody tells you. The common denominator isn't you. It's wounded people finding other wounded people and creating the same dynamic over and over until someone breaks the pattern. You kept attracting the same type of person because you were still operating from the same wound. You were still trying to prove to people who couldn't see you that you were worth seeing. You were still trying to earn love from people who didn't have love to give. You were still attempting to fill a void in others that only they could fill in themselves. Every time you blamed yourself for someone else's behavior, you gave away your power. You made them the authority on your value. You let their limitations define your possibilities. You internalized their projections as your truth. Their coldness became evidence that you were too much. Their distance became proof that you were too intense. Their silence became confirmation that you were too needy. You took every wound they inflicted and turned it into a character flaw you needed to fix. The shift happens when you realize their behavior was never about you. It was always about them. The person who ghosted you wasn't making a statement about your worth. They were revealing their inability to communicate. The person who criticized you constantly wasn't exposing your flaws. They were projecting their self-hatred. The person who couldn't commit wasn't showing you that you're not enough. They were showing you they're terrified of vulnerability. Every single behavior that made you question yourself was actually them showing you exactly who they are. Once you see this, everything changes. You stop taking things personally because you understand that people are walking around reacting to their own inner world, not to you. The person who snapped at you in the grocery store wasn't responding to something you did. They were responding to the stress they've been carrying for weeks. The friend who suddenly disappeared wasn't rejecting you. They were drowning in their own life and didn't know how to reach out. The partner who couldn't express love wasn't withholding from you. They were empty themselves. This doesn't mean you excuse harmful behavior. It means you stop making it about your inadequacy. You can acknowledge someone hurt you without believing you deserved it. You can recognize a pattern without thinking you're the reason for the pattern. You can see that someone treated you poorly and understand it was their wound expressing itself, not your worth being measured and found lacking. The people who hurt you the most were often hurting the most themselves. The ones who made you feel invisible learned early that being seen was dangerous. The ones who couldn't give you consistency never experienced consistency themselves. The ones who criticized you mercilessly had voices in their own heads saying worse things. They weren't equipped to give you what you needed because they never received it themselves. They were operating from deficit, trying to give from an empty cup, projecting their lack onto you. When you finally understand this, you stop waiting for them to validate you. You stop needing them to admit they were wrong. You stop hoping they'll wake up one day and realize what they lost. You release the need for closure from people who can't give it because closure comes from within now. You close the door yourself. You write the ending yourself. You give yourself the acknowledgement you were seeking from them. This is when your energy shifts completely. You stop being available for dynamics that require you to shrink. You stop participating in relationships where your care is weaponized. You stop showing up for people who only value you when you're useful. You develop discernment. You start noticing red flags you used to ignore. You start honoring boundaries you used to cross. You start choosing yourself in moments where you used to choose them. People notice this shift in you. Some won't like it. The ones who benefited from you making yourself small will call you cold when you set boundaries. The ones who took advantage of your empathy will call you selfish when you stop overextending. The ones who relied on your self-doubt will call you arrogant when you finally recognize your worth. Let them. Their discomfort with your growth is not your responsibility. Their inability to appreciate your evolution is not your problem. Their resistance to your boundaries is not your concern. You're going to lose people in this process. People who only liked the version of you that didn't challenge them. People who preferred you broken because it made them feel whole. People who needed you small because your expansion made them confront their own stagnation. These losses won't feel like losses after the initial sting fades. They'll feel like liberation, like space opening up, like energy returning to you that you didn't even realize you'd been giving away. If this is resonating with you right now, if you're recognizing patterns you've been trapped in, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel. We're creating content for people who are actively breaking cycles, who are done blaming themselves for other people's limitations. Your subscription helps us reach more people who need this shift in perspective. Please take a moment and subscribe. Now let's talk about what happens when you fully step into this new understanding. You start attracting different people. Not because you're doing anything differently externally, but because your frequency has changed. You're no longer resonating with people who need you to be small. You're no longer a vibrational match for dynamics built on your self-doubt. You're operating from a place of clarity now, and clarity attracts clarity. Wholeness attracts wholeness. People who've done their own work start appearing in your life because you're finally doing yours. These new connections feel different, lighter, easier. You're not constantly wondering where you stand. You're not analyzing every word, trying to figure out if they're upset with you. You're not walking on eggshells, hoping not to trigger them. There's space to breathe. Space to be yourself without editing. Space to exist without performing. This is what connection is supposed to feel like. This is what you were seeking all along in relationships that could never provide it. You'll also notice you have more energy. All that energy you were spending on trying to be enough for people who would never think you were enough. All that energy you were pouring into relationships that only drained you. All that energy you were using to manage other people's emotions. It comes back to you. Suddenly you have capacity for things that actually matter to you. Projects you'd been putting off. dreams you'd been ignoring, parts of yourself you'd abandoned in the process of trying to be acceptable to others. This is when life starts to feel different. You're not performing anymore. You're not auditioning for love. You're not trying to earn your place in people's lives. You're just existing fully and unapologetically, and the right people appreciate that. The right opportunities align with that. The right circumstances reflect that. Your external world starts to match your internal shift because you're no longer sending out signals that you're incomplete or inadequate or in need of validation. The old you would have read this and thought it sounded nice but impossible. The old you would have agreed with the concepts but not believed they applied to you. The old you would have nodded along while still internally blaming yourself for everything that went wrong in your relationships. But you're not the old you anymore. Something shifted. You can feel it. That's why these words are landing differently. That's why this message found you now. You're in the middle of a profound transformation. You're moving from taking responsibility for other people's pain to taking responsibility for your own healing. You're moving from making yourself small to taking up space. You're moving from seeking external validation to generating internal worth. This shift doesn't happen overnight, but it's happening. Every time you choose yourself, every time you set a boundary, every time you refuse to shrink, every time you stop apologizing for existing, you're cementing the transformation. There will be moments when you slip back into old patterns, moments when someone's behavior makes you question yourself again, moments when you wonder if maybe you are the problem. That's normal. That's part of the process. But now you have awareness. Now you can catch yourself spiraling and pull yourself back. Now you can recognize when you're taking on weight that isn't yours and put it down. Now you can see patterns forming and choose differently. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is awareness. The goal is catching yourself faster each time you start to internalize someone else's issues. The goal is building the muscle of self-worth so strong that other people's projections bounce off instead of penetrating. The goal is reaching a place where you genuinely understand that how people treat you is about them, not you, and that understanding becomes your default instead of something you have to remind yourself of. You're closer to that place than you realize. Every moment of awareness is practice. Every boundary you set is strengthening your foundation. Every time you choose yourself is rewriting your story. You're not the person who takes on everyone's pain anymore. You're not the person who twists themselves into shapes trying to be loved anymore. You're not the person who apologizes for existing anymore. You're becoming someone who knows their worth isn't up for debate. Someone who understands their value isn't determined by whether others can see it. Someone who recognizes that being in the wrong story doesn't make you the wrong character. Before we close, if you found genuine value in this message, if it's helping you see yourself and your relationships more clearly, please subscribe. We're building a community of people who are done carrying other people's pain, who are ready to step into their own power. Your subscription tells us this work matters. Please take a second and hit that subscribe button. You didn't fail. You were never broken. You were just in the wrong story. Now you finally get to write your own. A story where you're not the villain or the victim, but the protagonist who learned to stop shrinking for people who couldn't handle your light. A story where you're not defined by how others treated you, but by how you chose to treat yourself once you realized their treatment was never the truth. A story where you stop taking the blame for other people's inability to love you properly and start taking credit for your ability to love yourself fully. This is your story now, not the one where you keep trying to fix what was never yours to fix, not the one where you keep apologizing for being too much or not enough. Not the one where you keep waiting for people to see you who will never have eyes to see. This is the story where you finally see yourself, where you finally recognize that you were never the problem, where you finally understand that being unappreciated by people who couldn't appreciate themselves was never a reflection of your value, where you finally step into the freedom of knowing that how people treat you is always about them, and how you treat yourself is always about you. Write that story. Live that story. Become that story. You've spent enough time in narratives that diminished you. Now it's time to create one that expands you.